The Amorous Ghost by Enid Bagnold. Read by Huw Carr. It was 5 o'clock on a summer morning. The birds who had woken at 3 had long scattered about their duties. The white, plain house, blinkered and green-shuttered, stood 4 square to its soaking lawns, and up and down on the grass, his snow boots planting dark blots on the grey dew, walked the owner. His hair was uncombed, he wore his pyjamas and an overcoat, and at every turn of the end of the lawn he looked up at a certain window, that of his own and his wife's bedroom, where, as on every other window on the long front, the green shutters lay neatly back against the wall, and the cream curtains hung down in heavy folds. The owner of the house, strangely and uncomfortably on his lawns instead of in his bed, rubbed his chilly hands and continued his tramp. He had a watch on his wrist, and when the stable clock struck 6, he entered the house, and passing through the still hall, he went up to his bathroom. The water was lukewarm in the taps from the night before, and he took a bath. As he left the bathroom for the dressing room, he heard the stirring of the first housemaid in the living room below, and at 7 o'clock he rang for his butler to lay out his clothes. As the same thing had happened the day before, the butler was half prepared for the bell, yawning and incensed, but ready dressed. "Good morning," said Mr Templeton rather suddenly. It was a greeting which he never gave, but he wished to try the quality of his voice. Finding it steady, he went on and gave an order for a melon from the greenhouse. For breakfast he had very little appetite, and when he had finished the melon, he unfolded the newspaper. The door of the dining room opened, and the parlour-maid and housemaid came in and gave him their notice. "A month from today, sir." "That's nothing to do with me," he said in a low voice. "Your mistress is coming home tonight. You must tell her of these things." They left the room. "What's the matter with those girls?" said Mr Templeton to the butler who came in. "They haven't spoken to me, sir," said the butler untruly. "But I gather there has been an upset." "Because I chose to get up early on a summer morning?" asked Mr Templeton with an effort. "Yes, sir, and there are other reasons." "Which were?" "The housemaid," said the butler with detachment, as though he was speaking of the movements of a fly, "has found your bedroom, sir, strewn with clothes." "With my clothes?" said Mr Templeton. "No, sir." Mr Templeton sat down. "A nightgown," he said weakly, as though appealing for human understanding. "Yes, sir." "More than one?" "2, sir." "Good God," said Mr Templeton, and walked to the window, whistling shakily. The butler cleared the table quietly and left the room. After breakfast, he walked down his 2 fields and through a wood. He walked back again, steadied by the air and exercise. "I'll telephone to Hetty," he decided, "and make sure she's coming tonight." He rang up his wife, told her that he was well, that all was well, and heard with satisfaction that she was coming down that night after her dinner party, catching the 11:30, arriving at 12:15 at the station. "There is no train before it all," she said. "I sent round to the station to see, and owing to the strike, they run none between 7:15 and 11:30. "Then I'll send the car to the station, and you'll be here at 12:30. I may be in bed, as I'm tired." "You're not ill?" No, I've had a bad night." It was not until the afternoon, after a good luncheon and a whiskey and soda, that Mr. Templeton went up to his bedroom to have a look at it. The cream curtains hung lightly, blowing in the window. By the fireplace stood a high, wing grandfather chair, upholstered in patterned rep. Opposite the chair and the fireplace was the double bed, in one side of which Mr. Templeton had lain working at his papers the night before. He walked up to his chair, put his hands in his pockets, and stood looking down at it. Then he crossed to the chest of drawers and drew out a drawer. On the right-hand side were Hetty's vests and chemises, neatly pressed and folded. On the left was a pile, folded but not pressed, of Hetty's nightgowns. Mr. Templeton noted the crumples and creases on the silk. "Evidence, evidence," he said, walking to the window. "Something happened in this room after I left this morning. The maids believe they found a strange woman's nightgowns crumpled on the floor. As a matter of fact, they were Hetty's nightgowns. I suppose a doctor would say I'd done it myself in a trance. 2 nights ago," he thought, looking again at the bed. It seemed a week. The night before last he had lain working, propped up on the pillows and cushions, and his papers spread over the bed. He had glanced up, absorbed, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and traced the pattern of the grandfather chair as it stood facing the empty gate with its back towards him, just as he had left it when he had gone to bed. It was then that he had seen the 2 hands hanging idly over the back of the chair, as though an unseen owner was kneeling in the seat. His eyes stared, and a cold fear wandered down his spine. He sat without moving and watched the hands. 10 minutes passed, and the hands were withdrawn quickly, as though the occupant of the chair had silently changed its position. Still, he watched, propped, stiffening on his pillows, and as time went on, he fought the impression down. "Tired," he said. "One's read of it, the brain reflecting something." His heart quietened, and cautiously he settled himself a little lower and tried to sleep. He did not dare straighten the litter of papers around him, but with the light on he lay there till the dawn lit the yellow paint on the wall. At 5 he got up, sleepless, his eyes on the back of the grandfather chair, and without his dressing gown or slippers, he left the room. In the hall he found an overcoat and his warm snow boots behind a chest, and unbolting the front door, he tramped the lawn in the dew. On the second night, last night, he had worked as before. So completely had he convinced himself after a day of fresh air that his previous night's experience had been the result of his own imagination, his eyesight and his mind hallucinated by his work, that he did not even remember, as he had meant to do, to turn the grandfather chair with its seat towards him. Now, as he worked in bed, he glanced from time to time at its patterned and concealing back, and wished vaguely that he had thought to turn it around. He had not worked more than 2 hours before he knew that there was something going on in the chair. "Who's there?" he called. The slight movement that he had heard ceased for a moment, then began again. For a second he thought he saw a hand shoot out at the side, and once he could have sworn that he saw the tip of a mound of hair showing over the top. There was a sound of scuffling in the chair, and some object flew out and landed with a bump on the floor below the field of his vision. 5 minutes went by, and after a fresh scuffle, a hand shot up and laid a bundle, white and stiff, with what seemed a small arm hanging, on the back of the chair. Mr. Templeton had had 2 bad nights and a great many hours of emotion. When he grasped that the object was a pair of stays with a suspender swinging from them, something bumped unevenly in his heart. A million black motes like a cloud of flies swam in his eyeballs. He fainted. He woke up, and the room was dark, the light off, and he felt a little sick. Turning in bed to find comfort for his body, he remembered that he had been in the middle of a crisis of fear. He looked about him in the dark and saw again the dawn on the curtains. Then he heard a chink by the washstand, several feet nearer to his bed than the grandfather chair. He was not alone. The thing was still in the room. By the faint light from the curtains, he could just see that his visitor was by the washstand. There was a gentle clinking of china and a sound of water, and dimly he could see a woman standing, undressing, he said to himself. Washing. His gorge rose at the thought that came to him. Was it possible that the woman was coming to bed? It was that thought that had driven him with a wild rush from the room and sent him marching for a second time up and down his grey and dewy lawns. And now, thought Mr. Templeton as he stood in the neat bedroom in the afternoon light and looked around him, Hetty's got to believe in the unfaithful or the supernatural. He crossed to the grandfather chair and, taking it in his 2 hands, was about to push it out onto the landing, but he paused. I'll leave it where it is tonight, he thought, and go to bed as usual. For both our sakes, I must find out something more about all this. Spending the rest of the afternoon out of doors, he played golf after tea, and eating a very light dinner, he went to bed. His head ached badly from lack of sleep, but he was pleased to notice that his heart beat steadily. He took a couple of aspirin tablets to ease his head, and with a light novel, settled himself down in bed to read and watch. Hetty would arrive at 12:30, and the butler was waiting up to let her in. Sandwiches, nicely covered from the air, were placed ready for her on a tray in the corner of the bedroom. It was now 11. He had an hour and a half to wait. She may come at any time, he said, thinking of his visitor. He had turned the grandfather chair towards him so that he could see the seat. Quarter of an hour went by, and his head throbbed so violently that he put the book on his knees and altered the lights, turned out the brilliant reading lamp, switching on the light which illuminated the large face of the clock over the mantelpiece, so that he sat in shadow. 5 minutes later, he was asleep. He lay with his face buried in the pillow, the pain still drumming in his head, aware of his headache even at the bottom of his sleep. Dimly, he heard his wife arrive and murmured a hope to himself that she would not wake him. A slight movement rustled around him as she entered the room and undressed, but his pain was so bad that he could not bring himself to give a sign of life, and soon, while he clung to his half-sleep, he felt the bedclothes gently lifted and heard her slip in beside him. Feeling chilly, he drew his blanket closer around him. It was though a draft was blowing about him in the bed, dispelling the mists of sleep and bringing him to himself. He felt a touch of remorse at his lack of welcome, and putting out his hand, he sought out his wife's beneath the sheet. Finding her wrist, his fingers closed round it. She too was cold, strange, icy, and from her stillness and silence, she appeared to be asleep. A cold drive from the station, he thought, and held her wrist to warm it as he dozed again. She's positively chilling the bed, he murmured to himself. He was awakened by a roar beneath the window and the sweep of a light across the wall of the room. With amazement, he heard the bolts shoot back from the front door. On the illuminated face of the clock over the fireplace, he saw the hands standing at 27 minutes past 12, and then Mr. Templeton, still gripping the wrist beside him, heard his wife's clear voice in the hall below. Production, sound design and editing by Brenden James. Please support the Black Dog Chronicles by liking this video, sharing on your favorite social media, and subscribing. As always, we thank you for listening. This is Huw Carr.